case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers. It's I, Douglas Lain. I am the host of this podcast, the Sublation Magazine show. I'm also the head honcho here at Sublation Media, and I am the author of Noam Chomsky and the Time Box. I'm just going to keep mentioning that one because that one was about a time traveler who goes back in time to try to convince Noam Chomsky to help him stop the invasion of Iraq. So it has a kind of a slight tie-in to today's theme. With me today, as always, is Benjamin Studebaker. Ben, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker, the author of two books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
All right, so today we're going to be discussing, what was it, Operation Thor's Hammer, Operation Mad Max Fury Road. What did they call this thing where they attacked Iran? Do you remember the name of it?
Yeah,
Operation Fury.
Something Fury. Yeah, Operation Fury. Epic Fury. That's right.
Epic Fury. So we're going to be discussing the bombing of and war on Iran, and what the possible consequences of Trump's, I have to say, illegal act will be. I know that's a very mid-wit comment, maybe, because, so what, it's illegal, but it is worth noting that it seems to me to be a war of choice again, and something that I object to. I just want to say no war but class war at the outset, and that's all the lip service I'm going to pay to that. Benjamin, what do you make of Operation Epic Fury?
Well, I think it's pretty pointless to have much in the way of a normative attitude toward this, because this is something that is happening, and this is something that we really don't have the power to change. There is a sequence of events by which it can end, and we can go through the different sequences of events that can take place about how it could come to an end. But our talking about it is not going to be the thing that ends it. Nothing I say in this episode will contribute in any meaningful way to it ending or not ending.
Okay. Now, can I just point out that in the science fiction novel Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, at one point, one of the characters says something that accidentally the words go into a wormhole, get transferred across the universe into a moment in a negotiation in another world, on another planet, in another galaxy. And I think it was, do you have any tea? That in that language of the people in that meeting translates into a terrible insult about the other person's mother. And that sends the two species into intergalactic war for centuries. So you never know what magical, butterfly effect might occur, but it's a very, very unlikely that something you say would end this war.
All I can really do is try to understand it and invite people in the audience to try to understand it with me. In doing this, all I do is open myself up to criticism for failing to take the right normative line. So I am exposing myself to people's dislike of this approach for the benefit of trying to share what I'm able to understand of it with you and invite you to think about it with me.
All right. Well, we got that out of the way. Let's dive in to understanding this. The first thing that I want to mention is that, from what I've heard, the Supreme Leader and most of the leadership has been killed right away.
A large number of people in the Iranian leadership have been killed because there was a physical meeting which took place at the compound where the Ayatollah was. And the exact number of people who have been killed, it's hard to say for sure. I've seen estimates in the range of 40 to 50 important people. But this is a relatively complicated regime, the Islamic Republic. It's not a monarchy. It's a theocracy mixed with a republic. So it has theocratic structures and also republican structures. And this means that there's an awfully large number of people who are in some way, shape, or form significant. And that's just on the political side. Then you've also got the military structure, the republic, the Revolutionary Guard.
Yeah. So the question is, a few years back, this is just how I'm going to be. I'm 55, and so my brain only works in certain ways. There was a show starring Kiefer Sutherland, I think it was, called Designated Survivor. And the premise of the show was that everyone, the Congress and all the, the White House staff and the president and the vice president, they'd all been killed in a terrorist attack. And so this low-level cabinet member was a designated survivor, and he had to step forward after this devastating terrorist attack while the United States was under siege and take on the role of the president. So I'm wondering if we know.
Your president is still alive, as far as I know at the time that I'm saying this.
Right. The president is still alive. And so that's an interesting fact, which given the theocratic nature of Iran, how much power and authority and ability to lead could the president take up in this moment? And does it really come down now to the power of the presidency in Iran?
Not necessarily. The president becomes one of the three people who are on the interim council, which holds the powers of the Ayatollah, of the supreme leader, while the council of experts picks the new supreme leader. So the president becomes one of these three people. So the president's role is enlarged some by being part of the powers of the supreme leader during this interim period. So the president becomes more significant. However, this interim body is only supposed to rule until a new supreme leader is chosen by the council of experts. And when you look at that body, it's got two other people. There are two other people who are currently holding the supreme leader's powers together with the president. So the president does not simply possess all of those powers and does not simply step into that role. It's still circumscribed. And that's why people have been talking about the guy who's a Kantian, and then there's the Ayatollah who was elevated onto. Now, that guy who has been called Ayatollah, he's not the replacement for the Ayatollah. He is an Ayatollah who has been put in the interim mechanism until the council of experts can hold their deliberation and choose a new Ayatollah. That deliberative process takes too long to operate in an emergency situation, and the country needs to be governed while they're picking a new Ayatollah, so they have an interim mechanism. It's always possible that an interim body can try to hold on to power or try to seize power in a period, particularly if the council of experts struggles to pick a new Ayatollah or is too divided about picking a new supreme leader. It's also possible that military elements may look to use a power vacuum to try to seize power in the country. And then, of course, insofar as there are organized opposition elements, those organized opposition elements can also potentially exploit division within the leadership of the Iranian state to try to be able to do things they wouldn't have been able to do if that state power remained united. And that's what the Trump administration is looking to see happen. As for predicting which of these things is likely to happen, it's really hard to do that without very high quality intelligence about what the relationships are and what the different views are within Iran, within each of these bodies. So I can, from here, say, okay, here are some of the different organs of the Iranian state that are significant. And of course, any division or weakening of the Iranian state creates some level of opportunity for non-state elements in Iranian society. But I can't say, because you would need an incredible level of expertise. Even if I had an entire, thousands of people working for me as spies, I couldn't be sure that I'd be right. I would still be making a guess. And the Trump administration is making a guess about how much strength and how well organized and how ready to act the opposition elements are, and how divided and how much the military strikes are capable of dividing and weakening the Iranian state.
Now, say that again about what the Trump administration is hoping for, because to me, it's very unclear that they actually have any particular faction in mind to take power.
Yeah, they
but you
can't really push a faction because they're not deploying ground troops. So this is not like Iraq. There isn't going to be a large occupying force sent by the United States to create a particular form of government. What they're doing is they are breaking and disrupting the Iranian state to try to create an opportunity for somebody else who wouldn't have been able to successfully act without this breaking and disrupting to potentially act. And they're open to a range of possibilities about what that might look like, but they're taking a gamble that this will produce a regime that will be more interested in working with the United States than the previous government.
Right. And so are there people within the Islamic Republic already that might not, might not be outsiders, that aren't going to be representing the protest movement or anything like that, who Trump might accept or be pleased to see take power in this moment?
Potentially. It's also possible that more hardline elements that are even more hostile might get control of the state.
I know that's always a possibility. But my question is there someone, do you think, that the Trump administration had their eye on?
Well, Trump has said that even the people that he thought were likely to be installed were also killed. That the number 2, number 3, the people that he thought were leading candidates to take over the role, those people have also been killed. So
maybe there was a bit of a mistake made there in the on the level of this attack.
Well, that means that they didn't really care if those particular people were in fact brought into power. They are taking a risk here. They don't have a specific concrete plan. Lindsey Graham has said they don't have a specific concrete plan. They've said that they're leaving it up to the Iranians what comes next. And the comparison that I would make, and it's not a perfect comparison, but the nearest comparison I would make would be to Libya. In the Libyan intervention, there was an air campaign. There was no sustained deployment of U.S. occupying forces. There was an air campaign to debilitate the military of Gaddafi so that Gaddafi could not put down the rebellions that were taking place during the Arab Spring revolts. And as a consequence of this, opposition elements were able to prevail that otherwise would not have been likely to prevail. However, those opposition elements in the case of Libya were heavily divided amongst one another. And then what happened was civil conflict among those opposition elements. And then because there was a long protracted civil conflict, this attracted all of the mercenaries from all over Africa to Libya. And then during lulls in that fighting, those mercenaries would go look for work and look for things to do in neighboring countries. So it sparked civil unrest and major problems to do with attacks on oil infrastructure in Nigeria, and also all sorts of trouble in Chad and Niger, in Mali. A lot of trouble came out of the Libyan conflict in the neighboring states. And this, to me, is the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is that you get a protracted civil war, whether that's between the Iranian state and the opposition forces, or within the opposition forces, or within the Iranian state. Some kind of disorderly situation arises, which is difficult to bring to an end. And this results in a long-term conflict within Iran that spills into Iraq and into Afghanistan and some of the neighboring states. And indeed, one of the things that's happening that has not gotten a lot of attention from people online is that Afghanistan and Pakistan have started fighting. They're having border skirmishes. And Afghanistan has suggested recently, the Taliban has suggested that they might also consider going to war with Iran. And I think that might be aiming at perhaps trying to get the Americans to get the Pakistanis to back off, because if the Taliban were allied to the United States in doing something about the Iranians, then that might cause the United States to be less interested in helping or facilitating whatever Pakistan is up to. It also could result in Afghanistan getting a two-front conflict that it doesn't want. But the Taliban seems to be interested in trying to revive cooperation with the United States.
Now, my, uninformed intuition is that Afghanistan is not a major military threat to Pakistan or to Iran, but after the occupation and disruption
no.
of Afghanistan.
The Taliban would never successfully invade or take over Pakistan or Iran. But what the Taliban could do would be to contribute, in the case of Iran, to destabilizing the country so that something else can happen.
Right. So this would, if we take Trump at his word, at face value, this kind of result would be counter to what he was hoping to achieve. He is not simply trying to create disruption in the whole region and break things up. And
he is and he isn't. He wants to create enough disruption in Iran and enough instability in Iran that something else can happen. But he doesn't want to create so much instability and so much disruption that lots of different things try to happen at once, get in each other's way, and you get a civil war or a failed state.
Right. I mean, what you were talking about is that the civil war, the conflict, the inner volatility leaking out into the other nations that Trump is trying to put together into some sort of.
That is not how he wants it to go.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But it's a risk that he is taking by doing this.
Right. So why is it worth the risk? This is the question. What was it that motivated the Trump administration? Let's put the idea that he's just trying to distract, that it's a wag the dog situation around the Epstein files. Let's put that off the table. But other than that, what would be the reason for this move right now?
So the previous strikes during the 12-day war, during that conflict, Trump said that they knew where the Ayatollah was and could target him, but had decided not to give the Iranian regime an opportunity to negotiate.
Mm-hmm.
Those negotiations did not go well. The demands that the Trump administration was making of Iran were not demands that Iran was taking seriously. And the principal demand that Iran was not willing to take seriously was the demand that Iran give up uranium enrichment to court. Mm-hmm. So including, peaceful civilian nuclear energy, give up enrichment to court.
And now how much of the Iranian electrical supply relies upon nuclear energy at the moment?
Well, it's not so much that Iran needs nuclear energy because Iran has significant supplies of oil. However, if Iran has its own supply of nuclear energy, then it could focus on selling oil, and it wouldn't have to use some of the oil it produces to run its own grid. It would, of course, also be infrastructure that could be used to make a nuclear weapon. And that has always been an issue. The civilian nuclear infrastructure and military nuclear infrastructure are similar enough to one another. And Iran has at many points been alleged to be building infrastructure that doesn't have a civilian use, doesn't seem to make sense for a purely civilian purpose. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean that Iran was trying to build a nuclear bomb, but Iran might have been trying to have infrastructure such that it could build a nuclear bomb on a short timeline. Mm-hmm. A lot of states are currently in a situation where they don't have nuclear weapons, but they have a nuclear runway. So a period of time that it would take them to construct a nuclear bomb that is quite short, on the order of weeks or months. And they sit at that point. They don't make a nuclear weapon, but they sit at the point of being able to make one in a short span of time.
Right. And that's, I think, from the point of view of the Trump administration and most people, is not that different from actually having them. You don't want people to have a 2 to 6 week runway to developing a nuclear bomb who are not.
Nobody talks about these states. There's loads of them that have a nuclear runway of some sort. But if you go on Wikipedia and look up, which states have nuclear weapons, there's no map that's going to show you estimated nuclear runways.
Right. But there probably is in the Pentagon. This is known.
Yeah.
So the Iran deal, Obama's Iran deal, was that successful in threading the needle and limiting their ability to have that nuclear runway, or did it allow for the development of nuclear technology so that they could have this quick turnaround time on developing a nuclear bomb?
The deal from the Obama administration was controversial at the time that it was signed because many felt that the enforcement mechanism on that deal was too weak, that you wouldn't be able to have high enough quality intelligence to be sure that the Iranians were keeping their word. And so Trump tore that deal up. And of course, once you tear that deal up, to come to a new agreement is quite difficult. And what Trump was pushing for, which is no enrichment activity whatsoever, was a further demand that went beyond what the Obama nuclear deal had called for.
So the other thing that they were asking for in these negotiations is for Iran to stop funding Hezbollah, Hamas, other terrorist organizations that were an extension of its power in the region, right? That was another...
Certainly organizations the United States regards to be terrorist organizations.
Right. And that was also something that the Ayatollah was not willing to negotiate away.
Well, Iran often denies that it has relationships.
Right. He couldn't even admit that he could negotiate it away, right? He couldn't sit down and say, "Oh, you're right, I've been doing that, I'll stop." He couldn't, that wasn't
right. This is something that the states dispute. So the Iranians don't admit to a lot of things that American intelligence claims that the Iranians do. And since they don't admit to it, it becomes difficult to negotiate in relation to it. Now, whether they admit to it in an informal way through proxies, perhaps in some of the conversations that occur using, say, the UAE as a third country proxy, maybe there are unofficial conversations in which this is talked about. But in terms of what is put out in front of us.
What was the other point in the negotiations beyond nuclear bombs, terrorism?
The nuclear stuff was the thing that was framed by the administration as the real sticking point.
Right. Okay. But that's a convenient narrative because they can claim that Iran, was on the verge of creating a nuclear weapon that was an actual threat to the United States security, without really having to demonstrate that. There's not a way to verify that claim for most of us, right?
It would be more on the level of Middle Eastern security, I think, than straightforwardly U.S. security. Of course, once a state gets a nuclear weapon, it's much harder to touch that state. But then also, there are a lot of other states in the region that have said that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, they will pursue nuclear weapons.
Yeah, but
Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt.
But the rhetoric is, it was a threat to the United States because you can't get people to go and
it's a threat to global oil prices. Certainly, if you are potentially going to have multiple states in the Middle East pursuing nuclear weapons, that raises the general level of risk in the region, which raises the general level of risk surrounding oil. Although oil is not as big an issue now in the Middle East as it would have been 20 years ago because of the liquefied natural gas, the shale oil drilling that the Obama administration engaged in. Closures to things like the Strait of Hormuz are not as immediately pressuring on oil prices as they would have been 20 or 30 years ago when the world was much more reliant on that easy to access Middle Eastern crude oil. So this is one of the things which has enabled this. There are a few different things that have changed over the last 20 years that have enabled this to happen now. One is the fracking that the Obama administration engaged in. Another is the quality of the intelligence such that they can target specific individuals like the Ayatollah from the air without an on-the-ground presence by use of tracking people's devices, by use of satellite images and higher def and better images from space. This has made it a lot easier to get the information that's necessary to execute these kinds of operations. Sometimes people use language like we're bombing Iran. Bombing implies World War II or Vietnam War style stuff where you have a plane and it drops a bunch of stupid bombs and the bombs fall wherever and they're bound to hit civilians and bound to hit all kinds of things because they're just being dropped out of the sky and they have no ability to direct themselves. What's going on now are very targeted airstrikes. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no civilian casualties and that they don't, that there's no one who's killed who isn't intended to be killed. But it does mean that you are not having to drop an enormous tonnage of bombs on population centers to hit your target, which means the number of people that you kill becomes much smaller in total.
Right.
And the amount of ammunition that you need to accomplish your aim becomes much smaller. So your industrial production of ammunition that is required to be able to do the mission is much lower. People sometimes circulate graphs about how many shells Austria-Hungary made during World War I.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of stuff is not relevant anymore. The reason that Austria-Hungary had to manufacture an enormous number of shells is that each of those shells was completely stupid, and most of those shells exploded and didn't hit their target, and therefore Austria-Hungary manufactured a gigantic number of shells to try to hit targets that they very rarely hit. It's no longer necessary to operate that way. So when people think about the United States as constrained by its industrial production, there's a sense in which that can be true for certain types of military devices, but it's not nearly as constraining as many people on the internet think.
Right. So I want to point out that when you mentioned, people talk about bombing Iran and the difference, what immediately comes to mind for me is just how long it's been that there's been a call to bomb Iran. There was a song in 1980 by Vince Vance and the Valiants called "Bomb Iran," set to the tune of Barbaran, which played on the radio, which I heard quite frequently.
John McCain referenced it
back
in
right.
the 2000s. Yeah, but this has been technologically outmoded at this point. There is no military reason to bomb Iran in the sense of bombing Iranian population centers to kill enormous numbers of people or to destroy enormous amounts of infrastructure. That's not going on.
That initial call that was turned into a pop song parody was merged in response to the Iranian hostage crisis.
Right.
And so it is worth noting how long the United States has considered Iran to be a particularly noxious enemy of the United States. And I guess it's
so the United States has in more recent years been able to use the threat of Iran to bring many of the Arab states together with Israel and to make peace between Israel and many Arab states. So there has been a function to Iran sticking around. But just because there's a function to it doesn't mean that, therefore, the United States can't still have an interest in doing regime change there.
Yeah. So the question is, I guess, to go back to the kind of tactical question here, is what was it that made it worth it to lose Iran's status as the villain in the region to, as a negotiation tool with other states, and why was it thought to be worthwhile to risk completely destabilizing the region, I guess, because that is what you're talking about, right? That this could truly destabilize the region, introduce civil conflict, all within Iran and outside of it.
One possibility is that the administration has intelligence that has given it reason to believe that that will not happen.
I mean, we have to mention the protests and the clampdown on civil society that we heard about, that we can't get a good picture of. We don't know exactly what happened within Iran.
One of the prompts was, of course, that the Iranian government was arresting and potentially going to execute some number of thousands of dissidents, and we don't know exactly how many thousands. Different estimates have been thrown out by different people.
I've heard 30,000.
I've also heard less than 10 from people who would have a different view. So it's some number of thousands, but whether that's 4 figures or 5 figures depends on who you ask. Of course, the administration did not immediately intervene at the point at which those protests occurred. Now, why did that not happen? One obvious reason it didn't happen is that the hardware wasn't positioned to execute this intervention at that time. Another reason it may not have happened is that the intelligence regarding the Ayatollah's location and the meeting of many people at the Ayatollah's compound, that intelligence might not have been available. And that, as we understand it, contributed to moving up this operation. It otherwise would not have been done even yet. It would have been further delayed. Another possible explanation is the Democrats looking to have a floor vote on whether the administration should have the power to engage in this operation. So looking to potentially revise the powers that the administration has. And once that comes up, once you've got a possibility of Congress handcuffing what the president can do, the president then has an incentive to move before he can be handcuffed.
So, right. Now that's another question. Every time there's a war like this or a military adventure like this, people on the left, and I think rightly, point out that the president's ability to engage in war is limited by the Constitution, and yet, since World War II, every
significantly
war has
expanded by the War Powers Resolution, which is always misdescribed by the media. The media acts as if the War Powers Resolution limited presidential power. It codified the expansion of it because legally only Congress had the power to declare war.
Right.
The president stopped declaring war so as to circumvent having to go through Congress, and then Congress passed legislation saying when the president can engage in military action without a declaration of war. And by doing that, Congress conceded that the president has the right to engage in military action without a declaration of war. Now, this is going to be a factor going forward. And those who think that the Iranian regime can survive this are really banking on the War Powers Resolution and the rules that it sets regarding presidential use of force without congressional authorization. There's a 60-day window in which the president can deploy troops without congressional authorization per the War Powers Resolution. Now, one of the arguments that the president makes, and he's not the first president to make this argument, Obama made this argument too with regard to Libya, is that it's not a deployment if all of the forces are airborne. And if the airborne pilots are not being killed over Iranian territory, it's not a deployment. So that's an argument that we may see if this thing pushes out to 60 days. And by the way, for that reason, I think it is completely outside the realm of possibility that ground troops would be deployed. And so those who have compared this to Iraq or have suggested, things like World War III, there's no possibility of ground troops being deployed because politically already the poll numbers about this action are iffy. A large-scale ground invasion of Iran would not do well in terms of polling, and it certainly wouldn't do well in the midterm election. And it would certainly last through the midterm election if you were to do that. The aim here will be to try to end it before the midterm election, if possible, because it'll be difficult to win that election if this is still going on at that time.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree. And we have to think about what would give the Trump administration the ability to claim victory and end the campaign. And I would think if they simply do enough damage or can claim credibly to have done enough damage to the Iranian military and their nuclear weapons facilities, then they can end the conflict, end their bombing campaign and walk away. The regime, I don't think that they're that committed to any particular outcome in terms of who rules Iran or the regime.
No, they've suggested that they're going to effectively blame the Iranians if the Iranians do not overthrow the government, that they've created an opportunity for the Iranians, and if the Iranians don't take it, then they're unlikely to give them this opportunity again. They are also, it bears mentioning that they've also said that they're trying to target the drone and missile manufacturing, and they're trying to target the Iranian Navy. So they are trying to debilitate the conventional mechanisms by which Iran intervenes in the region.
One thing that occurs to me, and this is maybe off to the side, but it seems to me that creating the technology so that wars can be fought on this level, targeting leadership rather than needing to engage in, warfare between soldiers or bomb broadly, is could have real significant blowback effects down the road. I mean, the technology that we have today, everyone will have in 20 years. It seems to me likely. Be very hard to contain. That, in other words, we have to work hard to contain the nuclear threat that we have a monopoly on, or a few nations have a monopoly on. To then also have to contain
the same logic that is used to discuss capitalism and competition in capitalism can be used to discuss nation state security competition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nation state security competition is always, there's a falling rate of dominance. You're always
right.
having to reinvent the form in which the dominance takes.
Right. I mean, they've been able to hold on to dominance through the use of nuclear weapons for quite a long while now. And
yes. And part of what's going on now is there's an emphasis on trying to encourage industrial production and manufacturing with an eye to sustaining military dominance. And a lot of this talk is framed as if it's about the economy, but it's really not. It's really about trying to sustain military dominance, and it functions off of trying to convince allied states that China poses a threat to them, and where that's not successful, trying to convince allied states that Russia or Iran poses a threat to them.
Mm-hmm. I remember back in the day, there was a kind of a saying or a thought that people on the left who were part of the peace movement would float from time to time. It's imagine how many wars we'd have if the leaders had to fight it themselves, like maybe give them swords and put them in a room or something like that. And this seems like
in some ways the answer is more, because the political costs of this kind of action are lower.
Right. Now we're seeing like that maybe that the assumption behind that was, of course, that none of these people would want to put their own lives at risk to fight this way, but perhaps that's completely wrong.
Right. If this were 70 years ago, how would you target somebody like the Ayatollah? You would need to have rangers on the ground who would be able to spot where something is and call in, I need bombs at these coordinates. And you'd get a plane to fly out to that spot. And then it would drop a bunch of stupid weapons in the vicinity of that place and hope to hit whatever it was.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So this is how it used to be done in the 20th century. And a lot of people still have a mentality like that's how it works.
Well, look, in 1991, during Desert Storm, they pushed this idea that, they had smart bombs, they had smart missiles, and that they were really targeting things very particularly, and that they were minimizing civilian casualties. And then after the war, it came out that no, those smart bombs are pretty dumb, and a lot of civilians.
It's a lie that's always becoming more true.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because the investments that they are making are always about precision.
I just have to remind myself how long ago Desert Storm was, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I have to remind myself of how much technological.
How long ago Iraq was.
Right. Right.
In the case of Iraq, Donald Rumsfeld was disappointed to discover that he had to deploy more ground troops than he thought he was going to have to, given the quality of the technology that existed at that time. Now, people will point to that and say, see, you can't accomplish things with air power. But every time they confront the limits of their air power, what they then do is, yes, that then causes them to invest to try to go beyond them. So every time we have this argument every 10 years, it's a new argument because there is new technology which enables them to plausibly be more precise. And each time they are more precise than in the previous wars, just never as precise as they promise, never as precise as they claim. So right now, we don't have very much of this sort of dialectic going on with the concept of freedom, but we do have a dialectic going on with the concept of precision in military hardware.
Right. So on that subject of freedom, one of the things you can find on even liberal media channels is members of the diaspora, the Iranians abroad, stepping forward to say, we're so pleased that the Ayatollah is dead. We want to encourage Trump to finish the job. This will be a great day of liberation for our people. And, I understand the sentiment, and especially those people are probably dealing with having loved ones living under the repressive regime of the Ayatollah, who probably in particular faced oppression and threats to their lives. Well, that's why they're not there, one of the reasons. But
It's
it
also
does
why
seem
they
to me-
oppose the regime to the extent that they do.
right, exactly. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But I would say that I cannot really imagine the outcome of this being uh, in any way comparable to what I think of as kind of a normal liberal democracy emerging within Iranian society. It just you don't I just maybe I'm biased, but I just feel like you just don't bomb your way. You don't just kill off the leadership to create.
It's hard to know for sure because so much depends on what the conditions are in a country. One of my rules of thumb is I ignore expats, especially
Mhm.
when there's a war on. Expats have a beef with their country, which is why they left, and the beef plus the fact that they're not there, and so they're not in a regular normal kind of social relations with the
Mhm.
people who are there, makes them actively misleading sources much of the time. And that's not to say that any particular person who is an expat shouldn't be listened to, but in general, I am wary of expat opinion.
I'm going to interview an
across the board.
expat. I'm interviewing an expat over the weekend. But
Mhm.
but my logic there is to talk to him not so much about supporting or not supporting the invasion, but or the bombing, but what was it like to grow up there? What was the Iranian left like for him?
Right.
Because he was someone who's, you know,
Yeah.
go
One of
ahead.
the things that I think it also bears keeping in mind is that insofar as our government is acting, if they're acting on the basis of expat opinion, that's very bad intelligence.
Yeah, I doubt they
So
are. I mean, would
during
you think that it
Iraq,
would be?
Ahmed Chalabi was this dissident expat who became very important to the Bush administration. In cases where the sources are expats, often the sources give very misleading pictures of what's going on in the country because they want to see something in particular happen. And they really don't have a clue whether it will work, but they want to see
Well,
it tried because they have a stake in it.
right. I mean, look,
But
I think
sometimes you actually do have good inside sources, really good inside sources. And when you have
Mhm.
really good inside sources, that's not going to be public. We're not going to be able to find out who those sources are because they're too good to be revealed.
right.
Yeah.
Look,
And when
look,
a
look.
state has that, it is possible sometimes to pull off stuff that is really amazing in terms of what you can do with force. And that's why people think to use military force, because there have been cases where military force has been used and accomplished the goals that that state has. To give an
Mhm.
example, in the late 70s, in the CAR, in the Central African Republic, the French used the Air Force and a regiment of paratroopers to remove the Emperor Bokassa from power and then installed a pro-French government. That pro-French government then succumbed to a coup from another pro-French government 2 years later. And then that pro-French government governed the country for about 10 years. Now,
Mhm.
after that pro-French government collapsed in the early 90s, there was all sorts of instability and civil conflict in the CAR. And today the CAR is riven with political instability. But from the point of view of the French at the time, they got what they were looking for, which was a regime change that preserved French influence in the CAR for at least another decade, decade and a half.
Mhm.
All right.
Hmm.
The classic American examples would be the bombings of Bosnia and Kosovo, the
Mhm.
interventions by the Air Force in those conflicts ultimately resulted in the creation of new states in Bosnia and in Kosovo and in Serbia having to cede that territory. Now,
Mhm.
there's all sorts of normative critiques that
Oh,
can
sure.
be made of all
Mhm.
of that. But in terms of the state getting its objective, when
Mhm.
security people point to you can actually use this and it can work, these are the kinds of cases that come up for them,
Mhm.
moments where that state has accomplished its objectives. And when people say on the left, well, so often there's some CIA coup that ruins a left experiment in this or that place. Every time you say that, you're admitting that foreign intervention was successful for the United States in that case.
Mm.
Every single time.
Right, right, right. Yeah. Okay. Yep. You're right. So I have this built-in lefty, blinders about what really happens
But there have
politically.
also been disasters. Libya was a disaster. Iraq was a disaster.
Yeah.
Afghanistan was a disaster. Both of these things can be true at the same time. It depends so much on the quality of the intelligence. And the problem is we on the outside who give commentary, who are not briefed with all of this intelligence are expected to take correct normative stances about conflicts we don't know enough about. And then the trouble is, if you respond to that by going, I guess I better trust the government because I don't have access. Well, if you do that, you're going to be wrong a lot of the time too, because
Right.
a significant portion of the time the intelligence is bad. So that's why I say there's really nothing we can do. We can talk about what we don't know. We can talk about what are the things that are likely to matter. But I can't sit here and tell you this is what the outcome is going to be in Iran.
Well, I think Iraq was an interesting, maybe exception because there was such an effort to justify that invasion and to sell the idea of it to the American public and to the world community, and because there was such a large amount, really, of internal division around it, that we did get a fairly good picture, and especially in retrospect, it seems that we got a good picture of what the motivating intelligence was. They brought it forward. You could read about it. You could, and at the time I thought, oh, these are people who don't really care what is good intelligence. The same thing sort of true with Russiagate, right? Now we can see that the kind of intelligence that was concocted to support the notion that there was a collusion between Trump and Putin was biased and kind of was willfully
and this is
in
why,
error.
by the way, Doug, when we start talking about intelligence that has been released to the public, I'm always very skeptical of that, because if it's being shared with us, it's not that important.
Well, but in the case of Iraq and in the case of Russiagate, those were important.
Well, whatever the real reason was that they wanted to do that, it wasn't going to be understood just by reading the intelligence disclosures. And that's why there was all this, are they lying stuff? Because it didn't seem like the intelligence they were disclosing could really explain why they wanted to do this.
Yeah, no, there were motivations in both cases that had very little to do with what the outcomes or the supposed justifications were. So when you have motivated reasoning, you're going to take a bit of evidence and believe it, justify it, rationalize it in order to justify what you're doing. And so we can see the motivated reasoning behind the invasion of Iraq. We can see the motivated reasoning.
We can't, though, because we can only see the part of it that's being shared with us. And so there's a constant suspicion, and I think not unjustifiably, that what was being shared with us was only part of the reasoning, or was a mask or something which concealed the actual reasoning. And I think people were reasonable in feeling that way about it, because the intelligence offered such a poor explanation. It seemed that there had to be something else.
Yeah, here's how the kind of judgment I make. If someone is presenting obviously poor intelligence, poor arguments, clearly fraudulent reports, during the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, there was a bit of intelligence that came from somebody like undergraduate's research paper or in the mix. It was just when you're presented with that low level of evidence, you can assume that the motivation is basically that what you're dealing with is a motivated reasoner, that these are people who are not, they're not, if they had something more substantial to offer you, maybe it wouldn't be the absolute truth. They would, right?
Not necessarily. Sometimes the real evidence is not something you can publicly share, because sharing it would give away something about how you got it. And then sometimes you have people who are genuinely not good at their jobs. And this is something that has to be considered. Sometimes political leaders are not good at their jobs and make mistakes. The Iraq War is, to me, one of the stupidest things that the United States has ever done, because the Iraq War involved a deployment of troops for a permanent occupying force. It became incredibly expensive relative to other regime change operations. So if you put the Iraq War in the context of, say, British and French attempts to flip post-colonial governments in Africa, if you put it in the context of that, or American operations in Latin America, this was an extremely expensive, high cost, no reward war that was fought in a profoundly dumb way, which is also why I just brook no comparison of Trump to Bush. Because in terms of raison d'etat, what's in the state's interest, Trump's conflicts do not have the cost footprint for the American military that the Iraq and Afghan wars had on the United States, to the point where, in 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, the Bush administration was genuinely too tied up with these occupations to be able to offer any kind of response to that, which was shocking. And, if you look at the
I remember that
of the Bush administration officials trying to respond to the Russian invasion of Georgia, they were completely blown away by it. Condoleezza Rice looked like she had seen a ghost. They were dumbfounded by that, and they were caught totally flat-footed. They couldn't do anything about it. And the Russian military, in the reports that followed, had all sorts of inadequacies and deficiencies. But because the military footprint was so heavily in the Middle East, there was nothing they could do. They had looked at the Russians as an ally in the war on terror, because the Russians had had their own issues with managing Islamic populations within Russian territory, and so assumed that the Russians were cooperating with them in this area, and that the Russians wouldn't care or would be powerless to do anything about the missiles that they had deployed to Eastern Europe and the NATO expansion that they had done there. Now, if you took that as your example of what's U.S. military capability, you would be, and indeed many of us were, including myself to some degree, completely flummoxed by what happened then in Ukraine in the early 2020s, where all of a sudden, with a very small amount of arms, the U.S. military is able to stalemate the Russians deep in the former territory of the Soviet Union. Completely changes your perception. But so much of this has to do with the specifics of the case. And by the way, it's for all of these reasons that I would regard that Bush administration as an incredibly inept gaggle of very silly people who should not be compared to anybody before or after in terms of just the consistent failure and waste of the foreign policy. Even from a completely U.S.-oriented point of view, there is no defending that Bush administration and the way that it conducted itself.
Right. Well, right. And I hated the Bush administration with a passion, not for those reasons exactly, but I would just say that I would just say, as a citizen, when you're being blatantly lied to and being given bad evidence, bad arguments, treated like a toddler, you should get offended and you should not trust the people talking to you. That's basically all I'm saying. And you should hold that, by the way, across the board. If someone gives you a clearly fallacious, obviously, wrong, insults your intelligence kind of argument, don't trust that person. Those people are not to be taken seriously, and either think you're an idiot or are idiots themselves, or probably both. So I would just, that's my feeling about the Bush administration and the way they handled it and what they did to Colin Powell. Oh my God.
He could have resigned. He agreed to go and give that speech.
Well, no, sure. I know he did it to himself, but still. The arm, you could hear them twisting his arms as he walked in. He was clearly, I think his arm was dangling down in pain the whole time. It was awful, just awful. So, anyhow, so we'll go back to the moment, to this moment. I won't get caught in the past. It seems to me likely that within a month or so, there's going to be an effort to wind this down. That Trump is going to try to claim, like, all he has to do is bomb enough to say, okay, we've done it. We've crippled their capacity to make nuclear weapons, and back off. Am I wrong about that? What do you think?
I think it's going to depend on what happens. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of what can happen. And the what can happen is in terms of what is Iranian society insofar as it exists? What is it going to do? And then also the question of what about the different elements of the Iranian state? How will they respond to the power vacuums that the Americans are creating in their state? Will
Mhm.
they get into competition with each other to fill these vacuums? If the Iranian state can have an orderly transition of power despite all of the gaps that are being created within it, and there is no response from non-state actors within Iran, then the regime can plausibly survive. But if the parts of the Iranian state turn on each other, and or if there is a major upsurge from non-state elements, then things could get really, really weird.
But and that could force the United States to remain involved past the point where maybe it would be advisable.
Not necessarily. It's possible that the United States could do a Libya and abandon the country after it has been shattered.
Right. Yeah.
And that multiple different forces could then become involved in it over a long period of time, and that it could recede to the background of the news because no American troops would be deployed there.
Mhm.
So there's a way for it to go very badly, but still not involve American troop deployment. And also people who say, oh, World War III, the Russians and the Chinese are not going to get involved in this.
Right. I think that's right. So, but the
Yeah.
so the yeah. So the question there is, if we're just thinking short term politically, to what extent could the region, if just shattered, flare up and create conflicts between other nations and weaken security overall in the region, leading to other moments where the United States has to get involved. I mean, it may
Yeah, you
not
could
be
see instability in Iraq, for instance. I think that's
yeah.
a likely possibility. You could see
Mhm.
instability in Afghanistan. We're already seeing that.
Mhm.
We could see instability in Pakistan, depending on how things go out there.
Mhm. Right. And but even if that happened, it wouldn't necessarily it'd be kind of a complicated story to tie that to the Trump's bombing of Iran, and it wouldn't be
Certainly, lots of other people would be involved. And the argument from the Trump administration would be that they weren't able to figure it out
Mhm.
and that he
Right.
created an opportunity for them, but then they didn't figure it out. There's also the question of Azerbaijan,
Mhm.
because Azerbaijan has potential interests within Iranian territory. And of course, Azerbaijan has a lot of backing from Turkey. Turkey
Mhm.
often becomes a player in these kinds of situations, just as it was with Syria, and to some degree, even with Iraq. Turkey has its set of interests in this area. So,
Mhm.
yeah,
For
there are
for
lots of
every
ways in which it can get messy.
for everyday people in the United States, in Europe, which is, I'm because I live in the United States and know people in Europe, I think this way. The major worry, I think, is about oil prices and
Yeah.
potential
Politically, the
recession.
major concern is oil prices, inflation, recession. So this is where all that LNG becomes a really important part of the story. If you look at oil prices, anyone
Mhm.
can do this. Just Google the oil prices and look at the history. The oil prices that were elevated in the first Obama administration came down a bunch as all of the shale oil came online, right? And then during the Ukraine war, it briefly spiked. But that spike is gone now. It's
Mhm.
gone. Uh, and it's gone in large part because at this point, there's enough oil that is being drilled in many different parts of the world that to some degree, you can reconfigure global supply chains in response to disruption. Now, is that going to be to the point at which they're able to sustain this operation for a long period of time without major economic shocks being felt? That's an important question. Many who assumed that this kind of operation wouldn't be tenable have operated on the premise that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz would have incredibly severe economic consequences.
Right.
If it doesn't have incredibly severe economic consequences, and the airstrike campaign and the targeted assassinations and so on, if these things wrap up, And then you have occasional activity going on in which the United States is trying to manage security problems in the Middle East, with drone strikes and occasionally going after particular people at the level that, say, Obama was doing. This will not be a major political issue in the midterm if it looks like that by that point. If, however, the oil prices go through the roof, and if there is a sufficient level of instability, then it could continue to be an issue. But it would take a lot of instability for it to be an issue if the oil price doesn't go up, because there's not going to be an American troop deployment.
But do you think it's fairly likely that the strait will be shut for some time?
For some time, for some period of time.
Yeah, but
I don't know whether that's a week or a month.
I mean, yeah, enough to be consequential, more than a week.
Oh, yeah, it'll be enough to matter. It's already enough to matter. The oil price is already up 5% over, Friday. So it's already enough to matter.
Yeah. Well, and it's not even officially shut right now. There's just the ships aren't going through out of a conservative impulse to keep their hides intact because they don't trust.
I have seen reports that Iran has told ships not to go through the strait, but I don't know if Iran has the naval capacity to shut it, or how long Iran will have the naval capacity to shut it. But there could be a disruption for a week or for a month or something like that, and that would have a significant effect.
That's like more consequential than their ballistic missiles, I think.
Yeah. But part of what has been done over the last few years is not just the LNG, it's also pipelines that have been built in the Middle East to create alternative routes for transporting Middle Eastern oil that don't involve going out through the strait.
Well, it's not just oil, though, that goes through the strait. There's lots of things that are shipped through that region.
You can't ship a lot of stuff that's important to Western markets through the Strait of Hormuz because you would generally go through Suez to ship most of the stuff that's a consumer good, rather than take it out in Kuwait and then take it up through Iraq. That's not something that is typically done.
Okay, I saw a news report where they were saying, "Oh, well, look, not only oil, but look at these."
I'm sure some other stuff, particularly for the region. If you're talking about Middle Eastern goods, then if you're in the Middle East and your concern is the functioning of the consumer economy in the Middle East, that's going to be an issue. But in terms of something that you're going to feel in America or in Europe, no, I wouldn't think so. Not at that level. But if the oil prices go up, oil prices are felt in every part of the economy. So if the oil price goes up, then that's going to be a significant effect that may make it much harder for the Republicans to win the midterms if they're not able to wrap it up fast.
Okay, well, listen, we should wrap it up. But and unfortunately today I have an appointment, and so I can't do the second half today, but there will be something. Yesterday's Expansive Realist Writers Workshop will be released for patrons, so you can watch that 3-hour conversation. But I guess I want to ask, like, what, because that I come from the left. I am a leftist. I remember the peace movement or the anti-war movements, and I mean, the first time I went out and protest against one of these things was in 1991 against Desert Storm when I was 20 years old. I remember walking down to the Pioneer Courthouse Square and joining a bunch of other young people like myself with signs and, probably, Birkenstock shoes and all that kind of crap. But anyway, what can the left, you're saying nothing, but how can the left be consequential here without participating in perpetuating it or misleading people? Do you think there's a room for an anti-war movement in this moment?
I think politically it's become very difficult because first they got rid of the draft. So now the set of people who potentially are concerned about being deployed is restricted to a particular class of people. Then they stopped deploying large numbers of ground troops. So now most of the people who would be concerned about being deployed don't actually get deployed. And as it becomes clear that they're not going to get deployed, this issue will fade from political attention unless certain things happen, like a large spike in the oil price or large-scale regional instability that disrupts oil prices subsequently. there isn't going to be very much public attention. And so this issue, while it seems like it's extremely important, will only stay important if the administration continues to do this for many months, and if there are certain disruptive effects that come out of it. They have gotten better and better over the years at doing these operations in such a way that the American voting public doesn't get very interested in them and struggles to stay interested in them for more than maybe a week or two at a time. And I know that sounds incredible to people for whom we're watching this live, where this has just happened. But the ability of people to memory hole foreign policy events because they don't seem to have anything personally at stake in them in this country is really, really tremendous. And for that reason, I think that the thing for the left to do is look for ways to strengthen itself. Because if you want a different kind of world where this kind of stuff doesn't happen, then you need to strengthen your ability to make change in general, rather than making normative statements in a case where you don't have any leverage, you don't have any ability to change the outcome, and then you seem increasingly to the public, rightly or wrongly, like you're talking about something that doesn't really affect them.
Right. And yeah, and also, you have people standing up. I think Shalib said, the United States is a monster or something like that.
The anti-imperialism talk that's about saying that the country is evil and that people in the country who are not having a particular emotional response are bad people. That's not a way to build power in a country. The thing is, a lot of people in the left don't think that they can build power in the United States. They don't think that they can be a meaningful part of Western political debates. They sympathize with third worldist movements in post-colonial countries or in developing countries, or they sympathize with China, and therefore they're not looking to try to build anything in a Western country, and therefore they don't care how they look to Western publics.
Yep. All right. Well, listen, I'm going to end it there. Thanks, Ben. I think this was a really good conversation. And I don't think we said anything really controversial here.
It's what we didn't say. We didn't have an emotional display, and the emotional display is what everyone is expected to do. And if you don't do it, it's suspicious.
Okay. Well, listen, no war but class war. This was an abomination. I'm upset and offended. I think I covered it. Let's let's end it there.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.